Our topic this afternoon, as you all know, is United States-German relations. Are we drifting apart? That's the ambassador's phrasing of the question. It says almost all you have to say about the current moment. That question is of enormous concern to all of us, and there is a question of what is the nature of American-German relations now and in the future. We're delighted, of course, to have the ambassador address this very important topic. The ambassador knows the United States well. I didn't know it until a few minutes ago, but he attended high school here for a year in Southern Illinois. He received his master's degree after getting a law degree studying in Bonn and Geneva, a master's degree from the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy, including some studying at Harvard at the same time. So he has a link to the United States. He was stationed here early in his career with the Foreign Service. He joined the Foreign Service of Germany in 1975 after 2 years with the Office of the Secretary General at the United Nations. He's had what looks like a very, very interesting career. A lot of the time has been at within the Foreign Ministry itself. While there, he served on the cabinet of the Foreign Minister. He's been the private secretary to the Foreign Minister. Later in his career, he served as a deputy to the Foreign Minister. He's held the position of State Secretary, which is the highest civil service position within the Foreign Ministry. And in his later assignments, dealt with the questions which have been absolutely enormous. He was in the negotiations at Dayton, the negotiations over Kosovo, NATO enlargement, and the NATO-Russia cooperation agreement. He also, while serving as Deputy Foreign Minister, was responsible for the major questions of the moment, European affairs, European Union defense, the UN, transatlantic relations, arms control, the Balkan questions. The ambassador, in addition to having been posted to the United States, was posted to Paris. He's, as I say, dealt with the major issues of the day. We're enormously pleased that he's able to join us. We look forward to his presentation with the greatest of interest. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this warm welcome. It's a real pleasure for me to be in Baltimore. I have to admit that my relationship with Baltimore up until today has been focused on the Orioles, because I've been to this ballpark twice, and on food, because I hope this is not a trade secret. When we try to serve something that looks and smells and tastes like German food, we get it from a source in Baltimore, not from a source in Washington. So today is the beginning of a more intellectual level relationship of mine with the city of Baltimore, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for this warm introduction. I participated at a formal luncheon a few weeks ago in Washington where the person, and I will not tell you who that was, where the person who introduced the speaker said the following: "Ladies and gentlemen, you know that I have never bored you with a long and dull speech. Today, I'm privileged to present to you someone who will." So, thanks again for choosing a different approach. We have gone, let's be frank about it, we have gone through a difficult period in the German-American relationship. I will be the first to admit that that has been the case. At the same time, I think it's always important to keep things in perspective. And those of you who have been following the transatlantic relationship over the years, over the decades, will remember that, for example, in the early 80s, 20 years ago, when the issue was not Iraq, but the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, we were discussing a plan to install new American missiles in Europe to defend against what was perceived to be an increased Soviet threat, a word that we've almost forgotten to remember today. And at that time, when I was a junior officer in my profession, we had 300,000 demonstrators in front of my office window in downtown Bonn at the time. And I just want to remind you that in spite of the tensions that we've had over the Iraq issue in the last several months, we have not had in Berlin or in Bonn, or for that matter in Washington, D.C., any demonstration of that kind of order of magnitude. So just so that we remember that we have had tough debates in the transatlantic relationship in the past. This is not the first time, and I suppose it won't be the last one. As I came here this morning, I thought, what would be a good way of presenting to you what happened, why it happened, and where are we moving from here? And I think that a good way, maybe, I hope it's a somewhat innovative way, is to look at two dates in history, in recent history. One is November 9, 1989. For those of you who don't remember that date, it was the date the wall came down in Berlin. And the other date, of course, is a date a bit closer to the present, September 11, 2001. November the 9th of 1989 was, as we look at it today, and even as we experienced it at the time, one of the great moments of victory, of relief, of optimism that maybe our generation would really have a chance of creating something that was deserved to be called a Europe whole and free. And we know that when we obtained, we the Germans, when we obtained unification, that we owed it to the role that America played in the entire post-war period for 50 years. So that period of 1989-1990 was probably one of the really high points in a long and important German-American relationship since the end of World War II. Last summer, when President Bush, 43, not 41, who helped achieve German unity, when this President Bush, George W. Bush, made his first visit to Berlin, I arrived early, a day earlier in Berlin, because I'd been asked to brief Chancellor Schröder and the Foreign Minister on what people were thinking in Washington and what the issues would be that the two gentlemen would need to debate, et cetera, et cetera. So I took a taxi to take me to downtown Berlin. And I asked the taxi driver, what is this I hear about anti-Bush, anti-American demonstrations that are about to be held in connection with the presidential visit. How serious is this? Taxi drivers always know the answer to these types of questions. So he looked at me and said, and this was a real Berliner, and he said, you know what? Don't worry about it. There may be 5,000 or so, maybe a few more. But you tell your American, party, the guests, the presidential party, that we Berliners know very well that these guys could not demonstrate and express their view had you Americans not helped us preserve the freedom of West Berlin for 50 years and helped us to achieve unification a decade ago. That's as simple as it is. So forget about the couple of thousand demonstrators. The mainstream is where I am, said my taxi driver. And I told that story the next day to President Bush, and he said, can I meet the guy? But I had forgotten to write down his telephone number. It was too bad. So that was, the events of a decade ago. Now, 2001. The 11th of September of 2001 was, for me, just like for all of you Americans, for me, a day of particular tragedy and importance. For me in particular, because it happened to be my first working day in this country, in my new capacity as ambassador. I had arrived on the 10th from Berlin, and I went to the office early because I knew there was going to be a stack of paperwork to be dealt with. And I had an hour or an hour and a half for the kind of work that I had been planning, and then the world changed. And what happened is that Germans were, I think, among the most compassionate of your friends and partners around the world in reacting to the television pictures of the World Center and the Pentagon being attacked. There is no city in the world, there is not a city in this country where spontaneously 150,000 people gathered to express their sympathy and their shared sense of grief with 9/11. That was in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, a day after the attack. German companies, German-American companies were by far the most generous, and I've really looked at the statistics, in trying to provide help and relief. I created a little fund at my embassy. When people asked me, what's a good way for us to help, to give some money? I said, I don't know, but we'll set up a little fund, and you can send me a check, and I'll make sure it gets to the appropriate address. We collected, within just a few weeks, more than $50 million and gave it to individual families, to American relief organizations, and to others. There is no country in the world, no nation that has even come close. So in the immediate, my simple point is that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was once again a great coming together of Germans with Americans. In fact, and I'll add that in order to make my point here, because it was my first working day, I also had the opportunity to write my first diplomatic cable on that day about the attack. So the first cable from the German embassy in Washington with my name at the bottom was about what has just happened and what it means. And our cable said in a few sentences that we thought that this was going to change the way America would look at its defense requirements, at its security. It would create dramatic changes, and that we, Germans, should try to find a way to express unlimited solidarity. Because I wrote, I think that that's what Americans will expect from good friends. I don't think that is well known, and it's probably not in your minds, that Chancellor Schröder, who has been much criticized more recently on the Iraq issue, after having read our cable and having discussed it with his aides, went out the following day and said, we're going to demonstrate unlimited solidarity. In fact, he was criticized by the German opposition for using that word, because they said, what is that, unlimited solidarity? That's a blank check. In other words, you're in solidarity with everything. Why didn't you use just solidarity? That would be good enough. But he said, no, this is such a devastating thing, I want to say unlimited solidarity. And then a few weeks later, as you remember, when the Bush administration decided as a first item on the agenda to go militarily into Afghanistan, the question arose, could the Germans be part of this? And Chancellor Schröder went to the German Bundestag. You have to understand that in Germany you cannot send the troops anywhere unless the parliament gives its formal approval. So the system is a bit different from what it is here. He went to the Bundestag and requested approval of the deployment of German troops to Afghanistan, a place far away from Europe, and we had never, as you know, never in the post-World War II period ever sent troops to any such place outside of Europe, not as peacekeepers and certainly not as fighting troops. When it turned out that the vote would be close, Chancellor Schröder combined this question with what we call in our constitutional and parliamentary procedure a vote of confidence. And that meant that if he had lost that particular vote, he would have been out of a job. So, in a way, my point here is to say to you that he took a personal and certainly a political risk by trying to implement his promise of solidarity. He won that vote by a margin of exactly 2 votes. 2 out of 600. So it was really close. And that was November the 8th, 2001. And that afternoon, Chancellor Schröder called me on the telephone in my embassy in Washington and said, Ambassador, do you think that the White House fully understands and appreciates what I've just done? I said, now that you ask me, you deserve an honest answer. The answer is no. I don't think they have really followed that to the extent that is desirable, but I'll do my best to make sure that they will. And we made a big effort and spoke to literally everyone, including, of course, the National Security Advisor. And I think that President Bush, when they met the next time, started the conversation by referring to that risk that Schröder was taking. We have today, Germany has 10,000 soldiers deployed abroad in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in the Indian Ocean, even a small contingent in Kuwait. And when you consider that as recently as '95, we had 0. Because for many decades we thought that Germans, coming from where we're coming from historically, out of the catastrophe of the Nazi period, the Holocaust, the devastation of Europe, we shouldn't be in the business of sending troops to foreign places. But when our friends, when you, the Americans, when others said to us, we need you, you're a country of 80 million, we need your participation and your burden sharing, we started to change the policy. And we are today, I think that is also not really well known, behind the United States, the second biggest provider of troops for international peace missions around the world. That's a total change from what was the situation a few years ago. In the Iraq crisis over the last 6 months or 4 months, it is true that we had a serious disagreement. We felt that there was no urgency that required us to go to war, and we said no to the war. And you've all seen in the newspapers and on television what kind of tension and friction that has produced. However, while we said that we would not go to war, we did a number of things that I think my professional colleagues in Washington have continued to appreciate. We sent our Patriot missile defense systems to Israel when Israel said that they could use them. We did the same vis-a-vis Turkey. We actually made available 3,000 German troops to help guard US military installations in Germany so that the Americans who usually do that work could be sent off to maybe more important missions in the Gulf or elsewhere. Last weekend, the Washington Times is not known to be a leftist-leaning liberal newspaper. The Washington Times wrote, and I quote, "Defense analysts point out that although Germany did not send any troops to Iraq, it has played an important role in that conflict, second only to that of Britain." End of quote. I wouldn't actually have gone quite as far as the Washington Times, but I thought it's only fair for me to share that assessment with you. Now, having said all that, I guess your question to me would be, so if all has gone so well, and if you Germans have done so many good things, where's the problem? And why do we have a problem? And where do we go from here? The military phase of the Iraq war is now over. And we are delighted that you won that war. We are pleased to see that you brought down this dictator, even though we disagreed about the need to do it now. But we're coming around and we're saying, okay, that was probably good. And we are now we are not going to be fighting with the Bush administration about the question who was right and who was wrong and whose action was legitimate and who did what for what reason that was not okay. My government is interested in being as practical, as pragmatic as we can be about the steps that now need to be taken as we move forward. Not only on the question of what to do in and with Iraq, but on the larger question of what is it that we need to do individually or jointly on the issue of international terrorism, on the issue of stability or instability in the Middle East, on the issue of weapons of mass destruction. And I could go on and give you a longer and more complete list of things to do. I want to spend just a minute, because I think that is an issue of current relevance, on the issue of should or should we not use the United Nations as we go from the military into the more reconstruction, rebuilding, nation-building phase in Iraq. I am aware of the fact that there are some in Washington who would rather do this totally without the UN. Why do we need the UN is a question. Well, let me give you an answer or two why I think that it is not a bad idea to involve the United Nations. And in fact, just so that I'm not misunderstood, I support, on this, like on a number of other issues, President Bush, who has spoken twice, quite specifically, about the need to find what he called a vital role for the United Nations in this project. The first reason that I want to give you is the problem of legitimacy. Legitimacy in international relations is something that you always need to write in capital letters. In other words, it's very important. And I want to tell you that whether you like it or not, the rest of the world, even if the rest of the world were convinced that everything America does is always for the best of all of us, the rest of the world does not necessarily like the idea that automatically everything America does in the world is legitimate. We would like to see some kind of blessing from the kinds of organizations which we created at the request and at the initiative of the United States. The UN was not an invention of the Germans or the Japanese. It was your great achievement of creating the UN system and the international financial institutions and others after World War II. I want to be a little more explicit what I mean about legitimacy. I was deeply involved, as you mentioned, in the crisis prevention and crisis management work in the Balkans over almost the last decade. When we had settled the military part of the conflict in Bosnia in '95, we sent in an international administrator called the High Representative, who was appointed by a joint commission set up by the United States, Germany, France, the UK, and a number of others. And 2 years after he had started, we found out that some of these folks in Bosnia, in this case the Bosnian Serbs, were about to make decisions that were just not right, that would have taken the country back into ethnic division and potentially civil war again. And the High Representative said to us, "But I have no power to stop them." And we said, "But you have to. We can't let this happen." He said, "I don't have the legal right." So we had a meeting at that time from the American side. Secretary Albright, Secretary of State at the time, participated in that. We had a meeting at very senior levels in Bonn, and we decided collectively that we would give the High Representative the right to nullify any law that these guys in Bosnia adopted if it was not in line with peace and stability and so forth. And he nullified that law. And he said, "I'm doing it because I've been authorized by this huge coalition which works with the blessing of the United Nations. And there's no way that you can oppose it. And they accepted it. And that is, I think, a useful lesson as you try to figure out what is a good way to work with on the Iraq issue. Let's assume we create within weeks, as is now the plan, an interim administration, local administration in Iraq. I think that's highly desirable, and we support this idea. But let's assume that at some point down the road, they can't resist the temptation of having divisive decisions between, say, the Shiite part or the Kurdish part of the population. We hope that that won't happen, but we cannot rule it out. Who, is my question, who will make the decision to tell that Iraqi government that we're going to nullify their law or their decision? If that announcement is going to be made only, quote unquote, by an American, you're going to create quite a bit of resentment against America, because it will be regarded, it will most likely be regarded as a kind of diktat. And what right do the Americans have, now that the war is 6 months behind us, what right do they have to tell us what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do? But if you have someone who can say, I'm not just the sheriff for the Americans, I represent the whole international community, the Europeans, the Americans, and the rest of them, it makes it easier to sell that kind of decision that may or may not be necessary. So I think it's a simple matter of diplomatic wisdom to create as much international legitimacy, or at least the perception of international legitimacy, for the kinds of things that we will need to do together under US leadership in order to make Iraq the kind of safer place and more rule of law kind of place. I don't even dare say democratic place, because I think that's a tall order. Creating democracy in a short period of time is probably not such an easy thing to achieve. But we can help the Iraqis live in freedom and free of fear. And if we can do that, we'll have achieved a great deal. So I think that there should be a role for the United Nations, and you Americans should not be afraid that you're handing over Iraq to this UN bureaucracy. I think that's absolutely not what we're talking about. What we need to do is create in this situation as much legitimacy as we can. What does all of this mean now for our relationship, the German-American, the transatlantic relationship? I happen to believe that the Iraq dispute was and will be seen when we look back in a few years, not as the rule, but rather as the exception. I hope I'm right when I say that I think that this was an aberration. We failed on a number of fronts, myself included. We failed to communicate effectively with one another. We failed to understand one another. Our public opinions diverged. Our leaders started name calling across the Atlantic. All of that was not good. But I don't think that you will see that that's going to be the rule. I think this was a one-time thing. Why do I think that? When we look down the road, what is it that we want to, or rather we need to do together? First of all, I know that there are a number of you who have come from the business community. Let me just remind you that there is no relationship in terms of trade and investment that is as intensive as the one that your country has with the countries of Western Europe, and quite specifically also with Germany. The EU, by the way, the countries of the European Union, are the #1 foreign investor in the state of Maryland. More than 80,000 jobs in your state have been created or are being supported by companies from member countries of the European Union. You, as a country, the United States, are maintaining 800,000 jobs in Germany. And my most recent statistic demonstrates that German companies, not European companies as a total, but German companies alone, also have created or are maintaining approximately 850,000 jobs in this country. I have received a number of letters, not many, but a few, from angry Americans who, through the Iraq period of tension. And one of these letters read about as follows: "Dear Mr. Ambassador, I've been a loyal driver of BMW vehicles. And I'm now so angry with your government's failure of, supporting President Bush's policy on Iraq, that I am herewith informing you that I've just decided to cancel my next BMW, and I'm not going to buy one again. Yours sincerely." Now, I don't reply to these letters with a form letter. I sent, personal handwritten notes, and I wrote back. I said, maybe you want to think about this again. I don't know what kind of BMW you intended to buy, but if it happens to be the SUV version, the X5, I would suggest that you review your intentions, because the X5 is actually being manufactured in Greenville, South Carolina, and you're going to probably damage the job perspectives of a couple of Americans and not really do much damage to the guys back in Berlin or in Munich. That person wrote back to me and said, maybe you're right. And I've now invited him to come and visit when he has his next BMW. What I'm trying to say is that we have a very strong economic and trade relationship, and we have enormous mutual vested interests in maintaining that and not letting it be damaged. And that is why I really want to discourage, angry Germans who have been against the war, who have said, we will stop drinking Coke or Pepsi out of protest. I think that is as useless a gesture as the refusal to buy another German car in this country. Let's not get into this punishment or boycott thing. Let's get over that. Our relationship is too important. I want to finish and conclude on the question of what could be the best lesson to learn from this period of tension that we've gone through. How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? And I'd like to take you back to the point I started on, namely the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was the end of what we call the Cold War era. I think that throughout the Cold War era, that is, say, from 1950, or if you wish, from 1945 to 1990, and beyond. We had, as I also mentioned earlier, we had occasional friction, but we managed regularly in the transatlantic relationship to handle that friction and to overcome it. Why? Because we had a sense of shared strategic vision. We knew why we needed to be together and what we wanted to accomplish together. My point would be that as we move into this 21st century and as we face an unfinished job of fighting international terrorism, this is only beginning. It's not over with the defeat of Saddam. As we face the very complicated issue of eliminating or at least reducing the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, we need to recreate a sense not only at the top levels of our governments, but also at the level of you, the interested public, the political class in this country and in Europe as well. We need to recreate a sense of shared vision and shared responsibility. In the post 9/11 days, and I hope you will forgive me if what I say now sounds a little critical of the American government's policy. It's not my job to criticize the Bush administration, and I don't want to appear criticizing. But I think that over this last period, the last year and a half, because of the uniqueness of this new threat that became apparent in 9/11, the United States has tended to behave on the question of how you define and adopt a strategy, has tended to behave as if it wished to define and adopt the strategy in Washington and then invite the rest of the world, like Germany and Japan and the other Europeans, only into the implementation phase of strategy. And I think that we will work better together if you allow us to participate or invite us not only into the implementation phase of strategy, but also into the adoption and definition phase of strategy. We have a great deal of work ahead of ourselves. And one of the huge jobs is waiting for us in what we can call the Greater Middle East. It is a wonderful thing, and I want to really applaud President Bush and his team for now having made the decision to go ahead with the roadmap, the so-called roadmap on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that is, in my personal view, almost overdue. It is extremely important. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the details, we have an enormous opportunity in this particular case to work together hand in glove. Because at no point in the past has there been, on this particular issue of the Middle East, as much unity of purpose and of paper as we have right now between America and her European allies. This roadmap is a paper that has been now signed off by President Bush as well as by the entire European Union. We are united behind it. And that's very different from the old days when American presidents would say this, and then say a French president or someone else in Europe would say that. And we would appear to be at least not united, often divided on these types of issues. above and beyond the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are larger questions in that region. How best to deal with Iran, a very big and very important country. How can we help Iran move, hopefully, into a phase where human rights, non-proliferation, and other principles that we subscribe to will be, better observed in that country? And I could go on and on and on. In other words, I think what we need is a kind of a transatlantic interagency process, which we haven't had. We've had a bit of name-calling recently, but we have not had a serious effort. You know, it doesn't always have to be President Bush and Chancellor Schröder themselves. They have other work to do. But we can have senior officials help create a sense of shared responsibility and shared vision on how best to deal with this or that issue. And coming back to the Middle East question, I could tell you, if I had the time, of at least 15 individual specific areas in this Middle East scenario where I think it will be to mutual benefit for America to exploit its advantage and for Europeans to chip in here and there where we have a relative advantage because of existing commercial relations or political relationships, etc. I am not pessimistic at all about the transatlantic future. And I'm not pessimistic about the German-American future because of the many areas I spoke about, some where we have been doing good work all along, and the many areas where we have to work together if we don't want to damage our own interests. There is no way that we can control transatlantic container traffic in terms of homeland security without working together very closely. I was invited to sign a German-American agreement with the U.S. Customs Commissioner, is the word commissioner? 6 months ago or so. That agreement allows U.S. agents, customs agents, to control containers that are loaded on board. You're a port city here in Baltimore. You know about this. That are loaded on board of ships, say in the port of Hamburg, as they, start their voyage across the Atlantic. In other words, we have a system between Germany and the United States now where you have increased security regarding what is in those containers that come from Hamburg and arrive in your port here. That's the way to go. And it requires not less, but more integrated work. And I think that we're ready to take up any American offer to do that. I want to finish my presentation, which is already too long, by reminding you of what a famous American author, Mark Twain, said when he was on his trip through Europe 140 years ago or so. They offered him an opportunity to listen to the music of a young composer at the time, Richard Wagner. Not well known, not as well known as he is today. And after the presentation, someone asked Mark Twain, "How is it? How do you like it?" And he thought about that for a moment and he said, "This music is not as bad as it sounds." And isn't that a good one? And I think I'd like to conclude by by saying that I think you can say much the same about the German-American relationship. Thank you for your attention.
For that marvelous and complete outline of where we stand and where we're going, we thank you very much. Yes, sir. Mr. Roper. Two parts of the question. One was a suggestion of the important American role in the development of Germany, and the more specific question, I guess the general question is how American troop presence relates to that now, but the specific question is what's the future of American troops in Germany?
The presence of the U.S. military presence has been reduced significantly over the last decade. And we have not quarreled much about that reduction because we agreed that the main threat against which that troop presence, that big troop presence had been created in the first place, that threat is no longer there. So your presence has been downgraded from what I think used to be 15 years ago, 330,000 or so U.S. troops in Germany to a level of where you have today, I think something like 100,000 or so troops in Europe, of whom around 70,000 are still deployed in Germany. The German land, Rhineland-Pfalz, continues to be the country or the province or the state, whatever you want to call it, with the largest number of American soldiers anywhere in the world. And they are not unhappy about that at all. In other words, when the locals read in the paper that the Pentagon is now considering to further cut down on the U.S. presence in Germany, the local mayors don't like it a bit. And they call us in the government and say, you have to talk to Don Rumsfeld and talk them out of this. In other words, a further departure of Americans from Germany would not be so popular. As a professional, I understand that the Defense Department wishes to re-examine every once in a while the proper deployment patterns and the needs and where best to have them. But I think that our relationship over this past half century has been one that is so rich in nature that it would be a pity if one of the key elements of that, namely the presence of generations of American soldiers, if that were to be eliminated completely, we would not be happy with that. We want America. We don't need hundreds of thousands of American troops in Germany for what purpose? But I think it would be good if you could continue to demonstrate that America remains committed to and remains present in Europe and in Germany. And a few troops won't hurt.
The question is, would you comment upon defense developments within the European Union?
You're right. There was a meeting a few days ago of just a few foreign nations. What the intention of that was to figure out whether there are ways for us in Europe to produce a bit more, as you would say colloquially, bang for the buck. It was not, please believe me, it was not a move to move Europe away from America or to downgrade NATO, not at all. It was you see, the problem is that Europeans together actually spent quite a bit for defense. All 15 EU member nations together don't spend as much as the US. But what we do spend is still a pretty significant amount of money. The problem with our defense spending is that we have what you would call not only duplication, but triplication, quadruplication, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there are more and more people in Europe who are asking a very simple question. If we have only one currency, and if our plan is to have one foreign policy, we have already one trade policy and one agricultural policy, why do we have, are the taxpayers asking, beginning to ask, why do we have 15 separate and costly general staff officers' schools? 13 different establishments to train our helicopter pilots. I don't know how many different types of airplanes. And it all adds to the inefficiency. In other words, people are beginning to think about what if we started pooling our resources more. And a couple of years ago, we Germans started to present the question, what if we started pooling our resources as a test model case in the area of heavy lifting, of transport aircraft? And we have progressed at least to a phase where we now have an initial joint European strategic lift, quote-unquote, command. In other words, where if we need a couple of airplanes to fly troops to Afghanistan, we could call on, say, an Italian plane if that were available at that moment. And I think that's the way to go. And if we do that with discipline and with farsightedness, we could save a lot of money that is spent on these duplication activities without necessarily spending so much more money in our national defense budgets. It would be great if we could get more out of our respective treasuries, but I think we can do quite a bit to produce a better defense contribution, and that was the question that they tried to address at that meeting. So don't regard that as a hostile act or as a questionable activity.
In spite of all the hands that are still up, we're going to have to end the session. Mr. Ambassador, we thank you enormously. I wish we had more time, but I think the spirit and outline and structure of your views are very clear. We appreciate them very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.